never thought a quiet street like ours could hold anything dangerous. We were the kind of neighborhood where people waved from their porches, where children rode bicycles in circles, and where everyone believed nothing bad could ever happen. But life has a way of hiding darkness in the most peaceful places, and sometimes that darkness lives right next door. I remember the day everything began. It was early winter, the kind of morning when the air feels still, and the sky carries a soft gray that makes the whole world look sleepy. I had stepped outside to put some old newspapers into the recycling bin when I noticed something unusual at the house next to ours. The curtains were closed. Now, that might not sound strange to most people. Curtains open, curtains closed, who cares, right? But our neighbor, Mr. Hale, was a man of strict routines. Every morning at 6:30 a.m., he opened his curtains. Every night at exactly 8 p.m., he closed them. He did this without fail, as if the schedule was stitched into his bones. But that morning, the curtains stayed shut. And for some reason I did not fully understand, the sight made my stomach tighten. I stood there longer than I needed to, holding the stack of newspapers against my chest and staring at those curtains as if they were staring back at me. Something felt off. Something felt wrong. But I tried to shake it off. Maybe he forgot. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he slept in. People are allowed to change their routines, I told myself. But still, I kept looking. When I finally returned inside, the warmth of my home felt different somehow, as if a quiet heaviness had followed me in through the door. I made myself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and kept glancing toward that house. And that was the first time I heard it. A soft, faint sound, almost like crying. I told myself it must be the wind, or maybe a cat, or maybe something in my own head. But deep down, I knew I had never heard anything like that before. For the next hour, I tried to distract myself. I washed the dishes, I folded some clothes, I even turned on the small radio in my kitchen, hoping the soft music would pull me out of whatever strange feeling had crawled into me. But it didn't, because every few minutes, I found myself walking past the window again, glancing toward the house next door, trying to shake the growing worry in my chest. I didn't know it then, but that morning was the beginning of something that would change me and change the way I saw people forever. The house next door was holding a dark secret, and I was about to step right into the middle of it. The first time I saw Mr. Hale months before that winter morning, he had given me a friendly nod and a quiet smile. He was a tall man, thin but not fragile, with a calm voice and gentle eyes. Some people said he looked lonely, but I thought he simply looked peaceful. He had moved into that house about a year earlier, after the previous owners left. He didn't talk much, but he always responded politely whenever someone greeted him. He carried himself like someone who had lived through more than he ever spoke about. But that morning, I realized how little I truly knew about him. Around noon, I noticed something else strange. The front door of his house was slightly open, not wide, just enough to catch the eye. I stared at it for a long time, trying to decide whether to walk over and see if everything was okay. My heart kept whispering, "Something is wrong. Go check." But my mind argued back, "It's none of your business. Don't interfere." I wish I could say I listened to my heart, but I didn't. Not that day. I stayed inside, convincing myself that I was overthinking, convincing myself that I was imagining things. Looking back now, I can see how wrong I was, because by the time anyone finally stepped inside that house, it was already too late to stop what had begun. That night, I could barely sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that faint sound, the one that had drifted out from next door, the one that had sounded like crying. I told myself I was being silly, but the fear kept coming back like a soft knock at the door. What if someone needed help? The thought crept into my mind and stayed there like a shadow. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of a loud thump. a heavy, sharp noise. It came from the wall that separated my bedroom from the neighbor's house. I sat up, heart racing, listening for more. But there was nothing else. Just silence. A silence so deep that it made the sound feel even more unsettling. I remember whispering to myself, "It's probably nothing. Just an old house. Old houses make noises." But deep down, I knew that thump wasn't the kind of sound a house makes on its own. I got out of bed, wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, and walked to the living room window. The street outside was empty. Everything looked still and normal, but the house next door, the one with the closed curtains and the open door, seemed darker than usual, almost like the darkness inside was spilling out. I stood there for so long that my tea mug turned cold in my hand, and then I saw it. A light. A small, dim light flickered inside the house, like someone was moving around with a flashlight. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was there. Someone was awake. Someone was moving. But who? And why were they using a flashlight in their own house? My mind began to fill with questions I didn't know how to answer. The longer I stared, the more my fear grew, spreading through me like cold water. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light went out, vanished, like it had never been there at all. I stepped away from the window, trembling. Something was happening in that house. I could feel it, but I was too afraid to face it. That night, sleep never returned. I lay awake until dawn, listening to the wind, listening to the silence, listening to the pounding of my own heart. And when the sun finally rose, painting the sky with soft shades of orange, I made myself a promise, a quiet, trembling promise. Today, I will check. I didn't know what I would find. I didn't know what I was walking into, but something inside me refused to ignore it any longer. That house next door had been calling my attention for too long, and I could not turn away anymore. Not when something, or someone, might be in danger. When I stepped out of my house that morning, the world felt different. The air was cold and my breath formed small clouds in front of me. The street was empty, but my heart was full of a strange sense of purpose, mixed with fear. I walked toward the house slowly, every step feeling heavier than the one before. The curtains were still closed. The door was still slightly open. Everything looked exactly as it had the day before, yet somehow worse. I stood at the edge of the porch, trying to gather enough courage to take another step, and that's when I heard it again. The crying. This time it was clearer. A soft, low sound, muffled, as if someone was trying hard not to be heard. My heart broke in that moment. Someone was in pain. Someone was scared. Someone needed help. I placed my hand on the door and pushed it gently. It creaked open. The sound echoed through the hallway, and the crying stopped instantly, as if someone inside had heard me. My breath caught, and before I could think, before I could step inside or turn away, a voice whispered from the shadows, "Please, help me." A voice filled with fear, a voice filled with pain, a voice that made every hair on my body stand up. That was the moment my life changed. That was the moment I stepped into a story I never asked for, but could never forget. Because the house next door was holding a dark secret, which is so dark, so heartbreaking, that even now I can feel the weight of it in my chest. But that morning, I did not know the full truth yet. I just knew one thing. I could not walk away. Not anymore.
I have always believed that every neighborhood has its own quiet rhythm, a gentle heartbeat made from the everyday lives of the people who live there. And for most of my life, I thought our street was one of those places where nothing unexpected ever happened. Families walked their children to school in the mornings, the mailman greeted everyone by name, and small everyday sounds, like the hum of lawnmowers or the rustle of leaves under passing bicycles, created a sense of comfort that made the world feel safe. My own home sat right in the middle of that peaceful street, a modest place with soft yellow walls, a small garden I tried to care for even when the seasons made it difficult, and windows that looked out onto the house next door, the house that would one day pull me into a story I never imagined myself living. When I first moved here, I was looking for a place to heal and a place to rest. My life had not been loud or dramatic, but the quiet sadness of losing my parents and the feeling of drifting through years without direction had made me crave stability. And this street seemed like the perfect place to find it. I spent my afternoons tending the garden, greeting neighbors, and drinking tea on my porch while the gentle breeze carried the laughter of distant children. That was where I first noticed the man who would become the center of the dark secret I would eventually uncover. His name was Mr. Hale, though for a long time I only knew him as the man next door. He moved into the empty house during late autumn, arriving in a small truck with only a few pieces of furniture and one heavy trunk that he carried inside by himself. I remember watching him from my porch as he walked up the steps of his new home. There was something about the way he moved, slow, careful, almost weary, that made me imagine he had lived through something difficult, though I did not know what. He was polite when he greeted me for the first time, but his smile was soft and thin, like someone who had forgotten how to smile fully. I did not want to intrude, so I simply nodded back and let him settle in. Over the next few months, I learned his routine without meaning to. Some people reveal themselves through conversation, while others reveal themselves through the quiet patterns of their days, and Mr. Hale fell into the second group. He woke up early, often before the sun, and I would see the warm glow of his kitchen light shining through the window while I made my own breakfast. He spent long hours sitting on his porch, reading old books with worn covers, or taking slow walks down the street while keeping his hands clasped behind his back. Every evening, right before sunset, he stood by his window and watched the sky change colors, and I would sometimes see him place his hand gently on the glass, like he was touching something far away. Even in his quietness, he seemed kind. He always returned a greeting, always helped stray cats that wandered near his porch, and once, when an older neighbor fell while watering her plants, he reached her first and stayed with her until her family arrived. Everyone spoke well of him, though no one knew him deeply. He kept to himself, kept his past locked away, and kept his emotions tucked somewhere no one could reach. Still, his presence added something calming to the street, like the soft sound of a familiar radio playing from another room. I never imagined that behind his calm exterior, there could be something hidden, something heavy, something dark. Life continued peacefully for a while, and I grew accustomed to the comfort of ordinary days. I spent most mornings tending my plants, something that helped me stay grounded when my mind drifted into old memories. I had lost my parents within a short span of time, leaving me with a quiet house and a quiet heart, and gardening helped fill the silence. Sometimes I would look up from the soil and see Mr. Hale watching me from his window. He always nodded politely before turning away. I did not think much of it then. Looking back now, I wonder if there was something he wished he could say, something he wished someone would notice. But in those days, I saw him as nothing more than a gentle, lonely man doing his best to live a peaceful life. Our neighborhood was full of people like that, people carrying hidden stories behind calm faces, so I never questioned anything. The first shift came slowly, so slowly that I almost ignored it. It began with the smallest things, a window left open during a cold night, soft lights flickering inside his house at unusual hours, and moments when I would glimpse him through the curtains, standing perfectly still, as if listening to something I could not hear. One evening, while I was bringing groceries inside, I heard something from the house next door, a faint sound, almost like a broken whisper. When I paused to listen again, it was gone, and I convinced myself it must have been the wind, but a strange heaviness lingered in my chest. A few days later, I found a small piece of paper in my garden, crumpled and wet from the morning dew. It must have blown over from his yard. When I unfolded it, I saw handwriting, small, shaky, and rushed. It read, "I am trying." That was all. Just 2 words. They were not addressed to anyone, and they didn't explain anything, yet they stayed in my mind for days. I wanted to ask him about it, but something inside me hesitated. I didn't want to intrude. I didn't want to assume anything was wrong. People have private moments, private struggles, private battles, and I had no right to pry. Still, The feeling that something was off grew heavier with every passing day. The street remained calm, but the house next door felt different now, as if a quiet sadness had entered it. I found myself looking toward his windows more often. Sometimes I caught the flicker of a shadow moving inside even when the lights were off. Other times I thought I heard soft footsteps late at night. I told myself it was none of my concern, that I was imagining things, that maybe I was projecting my own loneliness onto the silence of another house. But whenever I passed by his front door, the peaceful feeling I once associated with him was gone, replaced by a coldness I couldn't explain. One afternoon, while collecting my mail, I saw him sitting on his porch. He looked tired, more tired than usual. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes unfocused, and his hands trembled slightly as he held a cup of tea. I approached him slowly, offering a gentle smile. "Long day?" I asked, hoping to start a light conversation. He looked up at me with a weak smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Every day feels long lately," he said quietly. His voice had a weight to it, like each word carried a piece of something heavy. I wanted to ask if he was okay, but his expression made me stop. Some people build walls around their pain, and if you push too hard, the walls only grow higher. So I simply nodded and said, "If you ever need anything, I'm right next door." He thanked me softly, then returned to staring at the ground. That moment should have told me more than it did. There was something in his eyes that day, something fearful, something haunted. But I walked away, telling myself he just needed rest. Weeks passed, and the strange feeling never left me. The house next door seemed to grow darker, not physically, but emotionally, like the walls themselves had absorbed the heaviness inside. Sometimes at night I would lie awake and feel a tension in the air, a quiet uneasiness that made sleep difficult. I kept telling myself that it was nothing, that everyone goes through difficult times, that I should respect his privacy. But deep down, a small part of me knew the truth. Something was happening in that house, something he was hiding, something that made his silence feel frightening. I began to notice other small things too, a strange smell that lingered sometimes, faint and fleeting, the sound of something dragging across the floor late at night, and the most unsettling thing, the occasional soft crying that traveled through the walls on quiet nights. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it wasn't real, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone inside that house was hurting. I didn't know who, I didn't know why, but the sadness felt too real to ignore. My mind began to wander more often, imagining possibilities that made my heart tighten. Maybe he was struggling with grief. Maybe he had a family member inside who was sick or suffering. Maybe he himself was breaking under the weight of something he couldn't carry alone. I wished he would talk to someone. I wished he would let someone in. But every time I saw him, he looked more distant, more withdrawn, more trapped inside a world I couldn't see. One morning, while I was sweeping my porch, I saw him standing by his window again. His hand rested against the glass, but his face looked different now. Pale, strained, almost afraid. When he noticed me looking, he stepped away quickly and closed the curtain. I don't know why, but that moment filled me with a quiet dread. It felt like he was hiding not just from me, but from something inside his own home. I wanted to knock on his door. I wanted to ask if he needed help. But fear held me back. The fear of overstepping, the fear of embarrassing him, the fear of discovering something I wasn't ready to face. So I did nothing. I continued my days as usual, pretending life was normal, pretending the house next door wasn't sinking deeper into its quiet darkness. And then came the morning when everything began to unravel. The morning when his curtains stayed closed. The morning when I heard the first soft cry. The morning when the air felt heavier than usual, as if the house itself was holding its breath. At that time, I didn't know that the secret inside that house would change my life forever. I didn't know that a story darker than anything I imagined was unfolding just steps away from my own front door. I didn't know that soon I would be dragged into it, not by curiosity, but by the desperate voice of someone trapped in that silence. I only knew one thing. Something was wrong, very wrong, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the truth was already pulling me in, one small moment at a time.
I remember the exact moment the tension inside me finally grew too heavy to ignore, the moment when the strange feelings I had been carrying for weeks turned into something sharper,
something that pushed me toward the truth whether I was ready or not. It happened on a quiet afternoon, the kind where sunlight settles gently on the street and everything looks so normal that it almost convinces you nothing bad could ever happen here. I was watering the small row of plants along my porch when I heard a sound, a soft thud from the house next door, followed by a faint whimper, so light that it almost disappeared into the breeze. I froze, the watering can hanging loosely in my hand as I tried to listen again. For a few seconds, there was only silence, but it was the kind of silence that felt too heavy, too full of something unspoken. I set the watering can down and took a small step closer to the fence that separated our yards, not because I wanted to spy, but because my heart pulled me there, whispering that something inside that house was not right. When I leaned slightly toward the window nearest me, I thought I saw the curtain shift, just a tiny movement, like someone had been watching and quickly stepped away. My breath caught, and for a long moment I just stood there, unsure whether I should call out or pretend I had not seen anything. Eventually, I forced myself to continue watering my plants, hoping that by acting normal, everything around me would become normal again. But deep down, I knew that was only wishful thinking. That evening, things became stranger. As I prepared dinner, I kept glancing toward the window that faced Mr. Hale's house. The sky was turning orange, and the soft glow of the sunset usually made the street feel warm and comforting. But that day, it felt muted, as if the light itself was being swallowed by something heavy. When I looked toward his house, I noticed that the living room light flickered on and off more times than I could count, almost like someone kept switching it hurriedly. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking perhaps it was an electrical issue, but the flickering continued in a pattern that made my skin prickle. On for 2 seconds, off for 1, on for 2, off for 1. It almost looked like a signal, though I had no idea what it could mean. I took a deep breath and forced myself to eat, though every bite felt like it sat heavy in my stomach. Later that night, I sat in my living room with a book open in my lap, but I did not read a single word. My eyes kept drifting to the window, searching for any sign of movement next door. And then I heard it again, the soft crying. This time, it was clearer than before, trembling and desperate, muffled as though someone was pressing a pillow over their face to keep quiet. I stood up, heart pounding, and pressed my ear to the wall. The crying grew louder, just slightly, enough to confirm it was real. My mind raced with questions. Was Mr. Hale hurt? Was someone else inside the house? Was he hiding someone? Or was someone in danger? My imagination ran in 100 different directions, each one darker than the last. I paced the living room, trying to decide whether to call the police, knock on his door, or do nothing at all. I felt torn between the fear of overstepping and the fear of ignoring something truly serious. Eventually, the crying faded into silence again, leaving me with a guilt I couldn't shake. I barely slept that night. Every small sound made me sit up in bed. Creaks, taps, even the wind brushing against my window. I stared at the ceiling for hours, wondering if Mr. Hale was awake too, wondering if he was sitting alone in the dark with whatever pain was eating away at him. The next morning, I stepped outside and found something unusual on my porch. A small object sat near the door. An old metal key. I looked around, confused, wondering if it had fallen from someone's pocket or if a child had dropped it while playing. But the key looked ancient, heavy, and cold to the touch, not the kind of thing a child would carry. Attached to it was a small piece of paper, folded tightly. When I opened it, my heart skipped a beat. Written on the paper in shaky handwriting were 3 words: "Do not trust." That was it. No name, no explanation, no clue. Just those 3 haunting words. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the key, my hands trembling slightly. Was this from Mr. Hale? Was it from someone else inside that house? Was it meant for me, or was it dropped by accident? I didn't know what to think, but the fear inside me, the fear that had been growing quietly for days, suddenly felt sharper. I slipped the key into my pocket, too afraid to leave it outside where anyone could find it, and too unsure to throw it away. The rest of the day passed slowly, with every sound from the house next door making me tense. Around noon, I saw Mr. Hale step outside for the first time in days. He looked worse than before, pale, thin, and exhausted, as though he hadn't slept in weeks. His eyes darted around nervously as he walked down the steps and toward his mailbox. When he saw me on my porch, he stopped, hesitating, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. I offered a small, gentle smile, hoping to ease whatever tension was in him. "Good morning," I said softly. He looked at me for a long moment, then forced a small nod. "Morning," he replied, but his voice sounded strained, almost broken. He opened his mailbox with shaky hands, pulled out a few letters, and quickly returned inside without saying another word. I watched him disappear through the door, and something inside me whispered that he was afraid, not of me, but of something or someone inside his own home. That thought stuck with me long after he was gone. Later that evening, I sat in my kitchen with the key on the table in front of me. I felt torn between fear and responsibility. Was this key connected to what I had heard? Was it a call for help? Or was it a warning? As I stared at it, I noticed something engraved on the side. Tiny numbers that looked like they belonged to an old storage lock or a basement door. The thought of a hidden room or locked space inside his house made my heartbeat quicken. I tried to calm myself by reminding my mind that houses have locked spaces all the time, that people store things in basements, that there was nothing inherently strange about a key. But the note attached to it, "Do not trust," made everything feel different. I reached for my phone more than once, tempted to call someone, anyone, just to share what I had found, but I stopped each time. I didn't want to accuse Mr. Hale of anything without proof, and I didn't want to involve the authorities when I wasn't even sure what was happening. So I kept the fear inside me, alone. That night, everything escalated. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would come quickly, but the moment I closed my eyes, I heard it, the soft crying again, clearer than ever. I sat up, heart racing, and listened. The crying grew louder, more desperate, like someone was pleading in a voice too weak to form words. I stood and walked to the wall, pressing my palm against it. The sobs felt like they were coming from deep within the house next door. Then suddenly the crying stopped. Moments later, I heard footsteps, slow, heavy footsteps moving across the floor. I couldn't tell if they belonged to Mr. Hale or someone else. I held my breath, listening to the steps move to one side of the house, pause, then return. The movement had a pattern, almost like pacing. And then something happened that made my blood run cold. A whisper, soft, trembling and faint, drifted through the wall. "Please, don't." My heart froze. That voice was not Mr. Hale's. It was weaker, younger, filled with fear. I stood back from the wall, hands trembling, unable to breathe for a moment. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to help, but I was terrified. The fear of misunderstanding, the fear of walking into something dangerous, the fear of the unknown, all of it wrapped around me like cold fingers. I went to the window and looked outside. The house was dark. No lights, no movement, just a silent shell, holding something I couldn't see. I couldn't sleep after that. I paced my home, trying to calm myself, trying to think clearly. And that was when I heard something outside. A soft knock at my door. My heart leapt into my throat. I froze, staring at the door, unsure whether to open it. The knock came again, a hesitant, almost frightened knock. I approached slowly and peered through the peephole. No one was there. But when I opened the door just a crack, I saw something sitting on my porch, another piece of paper, this one folded more neatly than the last. I stepped outside, picked it up, and unfolded it with trembling hands. It read, "Help." Just that single word. Nothing else. My heart felt like it cracked open. Someone inside that house was reaching out, asking for help in the only way they could. I brought the note inside and held it to my chest, feeling a mix of fear, sadness, and responsibility. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Something terrible was happening next door. And whoever wrote those notes, whoever cried through the walls, needed someone to step in, needed someone to care, needed someone to listen. I sat by the window all night watching the house, waiting for any sign of movement. I knew the situation was growing more dangerous. I knew I was reaching a point where doing nothing was no longer an option. But I still didn't know what to do. Fear kept whispering that I was not strong enough, that I was not brave enough, that I might make things worse. Still, I kept watch, unable to look away. And as the sky began to lighten with the first signs of dawn, something happened that pushed everything past the point of no return. The front door of Mr. Hale's house opened. Just an inch, just enough to see darkness inside. But it stayed open. Like someone had opened it quietly. Like someone inside that house was reaching out again. That was the moment I knew something was unfolding next door, and whether I was ready or not, I was already a part of it.
When the real turning point finally came, it did not arrive with thunder or screams or anything dramatic like in the movies. It came in a quiet, almost gentle way, slipping into my life the way dusk replaces daylight, slowly and softly, until everything looks different and you suddenly realize you are standing in the dark.
It began on a Thursday evening, one of those evenings when the world feels tired and the air feels a little heavy. I remember sitting alone in my living room with a cup of warm tea, listening to the soft hum of the ceiling fan, when I noticed a shadow passing by my window, slow and careful, almost like someone was pacing. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself it was just the usual neighborhood movement, maybe a stray cat or someone taking a late walk. But the shadow passed again, this time stopping for a second longer, as if deciding something. Something in my chest tightened, not fear exactly, but that strange stillness you feel when your instincts whisper, "Pay attention." I pulled my curtain back a little and saw that the light in the house next door, the house of the quiet woman, the house that always felt like it was holding its breath, was flickering in a strange way. It was not the soft yellow glow I usually saw through her curtains. It was sharper, colder, like the light of a phone screen moving around in the dark. And then I heard it. The faintest sound, almost too soft to be real, like a muffled sob. I froze, my hand still gripping the curtain. That was the moment something inside me shifted. All the small, strange things I had noticed before, all the little pieces I had ignored because I did not want to seem nosy or dramatic, started fitting together. The packages she brought home late at night, always wrapped tightly and carried with both hands. The sudden way she ended conversations. The bruises she tried to hide but could never hide completely. The silence that felt deeper on some days. The fear behind her eyes when she thought no one was watching. I stood there, staring at the house, and every part of me felt pulled toward it. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for a long time. And that soft, painful sound coming from her home felt like a crack in a wall I had pretended not to see. I set my cup down and stepped outside, telling myself I was only checking, only listening, only trying to understand what was happening. The air was cool, and the street was almost empty, except for the dog that usually slept near the corner house. As I walked closer to her home, the sound became clearer. Not loud, but steady, like someone trying hard not to cry. My heart thudded in my chest, not from fear, but from the weight of whatever I was about to discover. I reached her door and stood there for a long moment, unsure whether to knock, unsure whether I had the right to cross whatever line stood between concern and intrusion. But then I heard another sound, sharper this time, like something falling or being pushed. That was enough. I knocked softly at first, then a little louder. "Are you okay?" I asked in a calm voice, not wanting to alarm her. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. My fingers trembled slightly, and for a moment I considered going back home and telling myself I had imagined everything. But then the door opened just a tiny bit, only an inch or two, and I saw one of her eyes staring out. It looked swollen, red, tired. "I am fine," she whispered, but her voice was not steady. It shook at the end of the sentence like a branch bending in the wind. "Are you sure?" I asked, keeping my tone gentle. She hesitated, and in that small hesitation, I felt her pain. It was like she was asking herself whether she was allowed to ask for help. Then she whispered something so soft I almost did not catch it. "Please, not now," and she closed the door. I stepped back, stunned, confused, unsure. I stood on her porch listening to the silence behind the wood. Then, as I turned to leave, I heard another sound inside the house, low and sharp, like someone giving a warning. And that was the moment everything became clear. She was not alone in that house. She was not safe, and she had been hiding something far heavier than loneliness. I went home, but my heart stayed at her door. I paced around my kitchen, trying to breathe, trying to think. Every instinct told me to go back, to bang on the door, to pull her out, to save her. But another part of me, the cautious part, the part that understood how complicated danger can be, told me that rushing in could make everything worse for her. I sat at my table and tried to calm myself. I remembered the strange nights, the noise, the shadows. I remembered the look she once gave me when she dropped her groceries, a look that lasted only a second, but felt like a silent plea. I realized she had been waiting, maybe not exactly for me, but for someone, anyone, someone who cared enough to knock, someone who cared enough to see her. And I had knocked too late. The next morning gave me no peace. I'd watched her curtains all day, hoping for a sign, a movement, anything, but the house remained still, too still, like the calm after something breaks. When evening came again and the street began to dim, I finally saw her silhouette through the window. She was sitting at a table, her shoulders curved inward, her head resting on her hands. She looked so small, so fragile. And then a man walked behind her, tall, broad. His presence filled the room like a shadow swallowing light. He stood over her for a moment. She did not move. Then he closed the curtain. That was the moment the turning point became irreversible. I realized this was no simple sadness, no quiet grief, no private struggle she would eventually work through. This was fear, real fear, the kind that hides behind silence, the kind that thrives in the dark, the kind that breaks a person slowly. I felt a strength inside me I didn't know I still had. A quiet strength, the kind that comes from knowing you can't ignore someone's pain anymore. I stepped outside again, slower this time, more deliberate, and instead of going to her house, I walked to the only neighbor I trusted, Mr. Harris, the elderly man who lived 2 houses down. He had lived here longer than all of us, and he knew things. He noticed things. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he nodded slowly and said, "You did the right thing coming to me. You were not wrong. Something is happening there." My stomach tightened. I asked if he knew something. He sighed, long and heavy, and said, "I have seen her trying to leave the house 3 times in the past 2 months. Each time, he pulled her back inside." I felt the blood drain from my face. And then he said the words I still remember clearly. She is trapped, and people who are trapped can only whisper for help. They cannot shout for it. That was when I knew this was no longer about curiosity or concern. It was a responsibility, a moral one, a human one. Something inside me clicked into place. I told Mr. Harris we needed to help her, even if she thought she did not deserve it, even if she was afraid, even if danger stood in the doorway. And that night, for the first time, I allowed myself to accept the truth of what lived in the house next door, a truth wrapped in silence, bruises, and fear, a truth she had carried alone, a truth that, from that moment forward, I could not ignore even if it meant stepping into a darkness I did not fully understand. That was the turning point, the moment when everything shifted from quiet suspicion to painful certainty, the moment when her secret became my responsibility, the moment when the house next door no longer looked mysterious, but heartbreaking. The resolution began quietly, the same way everything in this story seemed to unfold, not with loud decisions or quick actions, but with slow breaths, careful steps, and a heavy awareness that I was walking into something that required patience, compassion, and steady courage. After the night I spoke to Mr. Harris, I did not sleep. I lay awake listening to the stillness of my house, thinking about her, wondering if she was awake too, wondering if she was safe, wondering what she might be facing in that very moment. In the soft darkness, I felt a new sense of responsibility settle onto my shoulders, a quiet but firm decision that I could not pretend I hadn't seen what I saw, couldn't pretend I hadn't heard her trembling voice, or bruises were accidents, or her silence was ordinary. The next morning, I looked at the house next door differently. It was no longer just a neighbor's home, no longer the place with the quiet woman and the man with the shadowed presence. It felt like a space full of trapped breaths and folded pain, a space waiting for something to break open. I watched carefully that whole day, not to be intrusive, but because every hour felt important. And around noon, when the man finally left the house, slamming the door behind him as he walked to his car and sped away, I felt something in my chest lift, like a small door opening. I didn't rush immediately. I waited, afraid that maybe he was coming back, afraid of making a mistake, afraid of putting her in more danger. But after a long while, when the street remained still and his car did not return, I finally stepped outside and walked toward her door with slow, steady movements, almost the way you approach an injured bird. You move gently, you speak softly, and you do not force anything. I knocked only once, a soft knock, nothing demanding or alarming. For a long moment there was no sound, no movement, and I wondered if she was hiding, or asleep, or simply unable to move. Then, the door opened just slightly, the same way it had before, only this time her eyes were different. They were not wide with fear. They were tired, deeply tired. But there was also something else, something fragile like the first thin thread of trust. She did not speak, so I spoke first, my voice low and warm. "He left," I said softly. "I won't stay long. I just want to make sure you are okay." Her lips pressed together as if she were holding back 100 unsaid things. Then she opened the door a little more, not enough to invite me in, but enough to let me see her fully. The faint bruises on her arm, the swelling around her eye, the way she stood slightly bent, the way her hands trembled. "I am fine," she whispered, but the words were empty, floating without meaning. I shook my head gently. "You don't have to pretend. Not with me. I see you." For a moment she closed her eyes, and when she opened them, they were wet. She looked away, wiping her cheek quickly as if she wasn't allowed to be seen crying. "I can't leave," she whispered, her voice breaking on the last word. "He will find me." Those words sank deep inside me, heavy with fear and hopelessness. But instead of pushing her, instead of insisting she could walk out right then and there, I simply asked, "Can I sit with you for a few minutes?" She hesitated, torn between fear and the longing for someone to simply be there with her. And then, slowly, she stepped aside, just enough for me to enter. The house smelled of old carpets and something burned, like a pot left too long on the stove. The curtains were drawn, the lights dim, the air still. She sat on a chair near the window, and I sat across from her, not too close, giving her space. We did not speak for a long while. I waited, letting her breathe in her own time. And when she finally did speak, her voice sounded like it had been hidden for years. She told me bits and pieces, not everything, not the full story yet, but enough for me to understand the depth of her pain. She had been controlled, isolated, blamed, frightened. She had tried to leave more than once but had been dragged back inside. She lived in a cycle where every day felt like a test of survival, where silence was safer than hope. As she spoke, she kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if holding herself together. I listened, not interrupting, not rushing, letting her words find their own path. And when she finally stopped talking, she looked at me with eyes that seemed suddenly younger, as if grief had peeled away years of forced strength. She said, "I don't know how to get out," her voice trembling. I reached out slightly, not touching her, just offering the presence of a hand. "You won't get out alone," I said softly, "but you don't have to be alone anymore." She looked at my hand for a long time, and then slowly nodded, as if granting herself permission to let someone help her for the first time. That was the first small step toward her resolution, not a dramatic escape, not a sudden rescue, but a quiet acceptance that she deserved something better than fear. From that day on, I made myself available to her in ways that would not draw attention. I checked on her when the man was gone. I left small notes under her doormat with simple messages. "You are not alone. I am here. You matter." I talked with Mr. Harris again, and together we quietly gathered information. Safe shelters, emergency contacts, legal options, things she might need when she was ready. Every time I saw her, she looked a little different. Still fragile, still scared, but also a little more aware of her own worth, a little more willing to trust the possibility of a different life. And then one evening, something subtle but powerful happened. She stepped onto her porch as I was watering my small garden. She stood there for a moment, holding her hands together, and then she said, "He is leaving town this weekend. He will be gone for 2 days." Her voice trembled, but her eyes held a kind of quiet determination. And then she said the words I had been waiting for, words that felt like the first sunrise after a long winter. "I want to leave." We made a plan, simple and quiet. When the weekend came and his car pulled away from the driveway, I watched her from my window. She stood at her door with a small bag, not much more than a few clothes and a few belongings. Her hands shook, but she walked with purpose. I met her halfway across the lawn. "Are you ready?" I asked. She nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes," she whispered. We walked together to Mr. Harris's house, where his daughter, someone he trusted completely, was waiting with her car. She had arranged a safe house, A place where the woman next door could finally rest without fear, without being watched, without having to whisper her pain. Before she got into the car, she hugged me, tightly, trembling. "Thank you," she whispered into my shoulder, "for seeing me." I held her gently. "You deserve peace. You deserve a life where you can breathe." She pulled back, wiping her eyes, and then she got into the car. I watched it drive away slowly, carrying her toward something new, something safer, something she had almost forgotten she deserved. When the car turned the corner and disappeared, I stood there for a long moment, feeling both heavy and relieved. The house next door looked the same as always, but something inside it had changed forever. The silence no longer felt full of fear. It felt empty, but in a healing way, like a wound finally exposed to light. Over the next days, when the man returned and found the house empty, there was shouting, anger, slammed doors. But she was already gone, already safe. He eventually left, frustrated and defeated, and the house next door went quiet again, but this time it was a peaceful silence. Weeks later, I received a letter from her. Just a small handwritten note. She said she was safe, she was healing, she was learning how to live again, slowly, gently. She said she had made friends. She said she could sleep through the night without fear. And she thanked me again, not for saving her, but for standing with her until she found the courage to save herself. That was the true resolution, not the moment she left, not the moment she escaped the house, but the moment she realized she deserved a life without fear and allowed herself to take the first step toward it. And even now, when I look at the empty house next door, I do not see darkness or mystery or pain. I see the memory of a woman who survived, a woman who found strength within her quiet heart, a woman who walked out of the shadows and into something brighter. I see a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness, soft words, patient listening, gentle presence can change the course of someone's life. And I see proof that no matter how dark a secret may be, it can be faced slowly and bravely when someone finally feels seen.
The ending of this story does not come with grand celebrations or dramatic transformations. Instead, it arrives the same way the truth arrived, the same way healing began, slowly, quietly, like a soft sunrise that takes its time, stretching light across the sky little by little until everything looks clearer than before. In the weeks after she left, the street felt different, as if the air itself held a new kind of stillness, a peaceful one. I would wake up each morning, stand by my window, and look toward the house next door, feeling a mix of relief and a tender ache, the kind you feel when you remember something difficult but also recognize that it is finally over. Sometimes I would imagine her waking up in a safe bed somewhere far from here, feeling warmth instead of fear, hearing her own breath instead of heavy footsteps behind her, learning how to live without flinching, learning how to trust her own choices, learning how to speak without whispering. I hoped she was taking walks in the daylight, buying herself something small from a local shop, maybe listening to music she had once loved but forgotten. I hoped she had moments where she could sit quietly and feel proud of what she had done, even if she still felt fragile. Healing is slow. It is not a straight line. Some days are full of courage and others are heavy with memories. But every day she spent away from that house was another quiet victory, another small piece of herself returning. And as the days passed, the house next door began to change too. Not physically. It still had the same uneven shutters, the same cracked path, the same leaning mailbox, but the energy around it shifted. The shadows inside it no longer felt threatening. The silence no longer felt suffocating. The walls felt empty but free, like a room after someone has moved out and left behind only a faint echo of what once was. Eventually, a "for rent" sign appeared on the porch, and I watched as people came by to look at it. Some walked through the rooms with curiosity, some with indifference, and some with excitement, already picturing new beginnings inside those walls. I felt strangely protective over the house, not because I loved it, but because it carried a history it could never tell. A place can absorb pain and it can release pain too. And in time, I knew it would become a home again, one with laughter, light, and everyday life instead of fear. One afternoon, while I was trimming the plants by my porch, I saw a young family exit the house with wide smiles and hopeful eyes. They pointed at the yard, imagining where their children might play. And in that moment, I felt something settle inside me. Life continues. Spaces heal. People heal. Even the quietest stories have the chance to be rewritten. But the real ending of this story came a few months later when I received a second letter from her.
The envelope was soft blue, and her handwriting was steadier this time, as if her hands no longer shook when she wrote. She told me she had found a part-time job at a small cafe, the kind with warm lighting and kind customers. She said she was taking a class, learning something she had always wanted to learn but never had permission to pursue. She wrote that she had made a friend, just one, but a good one, and that she had laughed the other day, a real laugh, the kind that surprises you when it returns after being gone for too long. She said she was still healing, still learning how to feel safe in her own skin, still working through her fears little by little, but she was no longer alone. And then she wrote something I will never forget. When I look back at everything, I realize the moment everything started to change was not the night I left. It was the day someone finally saw me. I read those words over and over, sitting at my kitchen table with the afternoon sun slanting through the window. Such simple words, such powerful truth. Sometimes people do not need grand gestures or loud assurances. Sometimes they just need someone who sees their pain without turning away. Someone who notices the trembling hands, the forced smile, the quiet sadness behind their eyes. Someone who doesn't push but stays close. Someone who listens without judgment. Someone who knocks on the door even when they're scared. I folded her letter gently and placed it in a small drawer where I keep things that matter. Old photos, notes from my children, pieces of my past that shaped me. Her letter felt like a reminder that our lives are connected in ways we sometimes cannot see. We live next to people for years without ever knowing the storms that rage behind their walls. We greet them with polite smiles, exchange small talk, and assume everything is fine. But sometimes the house next door holds a dark secret, and sometimes the person who carries that secret needs nothing more than a soft voice, a patient presence, and the quiet courage of someone willing to care. As more time passed, I found myself reflecting often on everything that happened. There were moments when I wondered what would happen if I had ignored the shadows, if I had walked away that night instead of knocking, if I had chosen the comfort of silence instead of the risk of involvement. But every time I thought about it, I realized something important. Small choices can carry enormous weight. A single knock, a single question, a single moment of genuine concern. These things can shift the course of a life, and we do not always know whose life we are touching when we choose compassion over convenience. In the end, this story is not about mystery or darkness or danger. It is about connection. It is about what happens when we choose to see one another, truly see each other, beyond the walls and the windows and the polite smiles. It is about the quiet strength of a woman who survives something unspeakable and the gentle courage it took for her to walk toward freedom. And it is about the simple truth that kindness, even the smallest kind, can echo far beyond the moment it is offered. Now, when I look at the house next door, I do not feel sadness or fear. I feel gratitude. Gratitude that she found her way out. Gratitude that I was able to walk beside her, even if only for a short time. Gratitude that life gives us moments, small, ordinary moments where we can make a difference. And whenever the evening light falls softly across my yard, I find myself remembering her quiet, trembling whisper, "I want to leave." That whisper became a beginning, a doorway, a path towards something better, and it taught me something I will carry for the rest of my days. You never know whose life might change simply because you cared enough to knock. In this world, where so many carry silent burdens, sometimes the greatest act of kindness is simply to pay attention, to listen gently, and to let someone know that they are not invisible. We cannot save everyone. We cannot solve every pain, but we can stand with someone until they find the strength to save themselves. And sometimes, that is enough. That is more than enough.